Thank you, everyone. Before I hand it over to our speakers, I'll just explain how the meeting will work. The speakers will go first for a total of 30 minutes. Then we'll have questions and comments from the audience. The speakers will respond to your questions and comments at the end in their concluding remarks. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and I'll add you to the speakers list. I'll be using an equity speakers list, which means I may not call you in the sequence you raise your hands, but we'll prioritize Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers. Questions and/or comments are welcome, but please try to keep your contribution to 3 minutes. This will allow for more contributions during the discussion. Finally, we encourage you to post to social media throughout the conference to share your thoughts and experiences. Please use the hashtag RedOctober2025. You can tag Spring on all platforms using @SpringMag.ca. Okay, over to the speakers.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm really proud to be part of a revolutionary socialist organization that prioritizes land back. I think it's really important, and it's important for me to be here. We're focusing on 3 major land back struggles from the early 1990s, Kanehsatà, also known as the Oka crisis, the Ipperwash crisis, and the Gustafsen Lake standoff. We want to connect these struggles to current movement building. So first, briefly, the Oka crisis was a 78-day standoff in 1990 after settlers in Oka, Quebec tried to expand a golf course onto unceded Mi'kmaq land, or Mohawk land. The Ipperwash crisis was a 4-day 1995 land reclamation where Stony Point Ojibwe land defenders protected sacred burial grounds and demanded the return of stolen land. That same year, the Gustafsen Lake standoff in British Columbia was a 31-day confrontation between the Secwepemc land defenders and the RCMP. So I'll start by walking through a short timeline of each of these struggles, and Rithika will then provide deeper context and connect them to longer histories of Indigenous resistance. After that, I'll draw some connections to more recent land back and water protector movements, and then before we open up the discussion, Rithika will offer a broader political analysis of what these events can teach us today. So the Oka crisis was a 78-day 1990 standoff that focused on the expansion of a golf course onto unceded Mohawk land and burial grounds at Kanehsatà. The golf course expansion was being pursued by the town of Oka in partnership with a private developer. It was on March 10th of that year that Mohawk community members from Kanehsatà built a barricade across a dirt road leading into the Pines Forest. The Pines are a sacred Mohawk burial site that the town of Oka planned to use for the expansion of the golf course and building luxury housing. The barricade itself was made of logs, tires, and vehicles, a peaceful act of resistance to protect the forest and a burial ground central to the community. Early summer of that year, early in summer, that barricade remained a place as tensions rose, as the town of Oka obtained court injunctions ordering the Mohawk people to dismantle it. The community refused, referring to unceded land rights and centuries of ignored claims. On the morning of July 11th, the Sûreté de Québec, the SQ, launched a violent raid on the blockade, firing tear gas and stun grenades. This backfired against them as changing wind directions blew tear gas back towards the officers, which contributed to escalating tensions and confusion and then an exchange of gunfire. One SQ officer was killed, and then the SQ retreated, leaving behind their vehicles. Mohawk warriors then reinforced the barricades and took control of abandoned SQ cruisers and equipment. News of the police assault spread quickly across Haudenosaunee territory, the Six Nations Confederacy, and beyond. So on the afternoon of that same day, the SQ attack on the Mohawk blockade, another Mohawk community, Kanehsatà, started blocking the Mercier Bridge. The bridge blockade disrupted thousands of daily commuters and quickly became a national news story. This shifted public attention from what was framed as a golf course dispute to a large-scale crisis over Indigenous sovereignty. Additional solidarity actions and blockades arose in other Indigenous communities across the country, across Ontario, which we can come back to in the discussion. It was in mid-July of 1990 when the Quebec government called on the Canadian Army under the National Defence Act. And so then the Canadian Armed Forces moved in, began deploying troops in August surrounding Kanehsatà at the Pines. Over 4,500 soldiers and armored vehicles were stationed around the communities, and this was one of the largest domestic military mobilizations in Canadian history. Inside the blockades, food, medicine, and supplies were restricted or blocked by police and military checkpoints. Families there lived under constant surveillance and psychological distress, but despite this, communities held ceremonies, meetings, and press briefings asserting that this was not a criminal standoff, but rather a defense of unceded land. On September 26th, the remaining group of about 75 people left the treatment center from inside the blockade, which included women, children, and elders. This was a result of overwhelming military force and some were beaten and arrested by soldiers as they came out. Several were charged with weapons and obstruction offenses. But despite these arrests, no land surrender or military victory occurred. The golf course expansion was permanently cancelled, and public attention to Indigenous land rights reached new levels. So in the months and years that followed, the crisis exposed structural anti-Indigenous racism, police militarization, and the failure of Canada's land claims process. Fast forward about 4 years to the Ipperwash crisis. If we can move on to 2 more slides. Just wanted to show an image of that. This was a 4-day-long land dispute in 1995 in the former Ipperwash Provincial Park. This was on sacred Anishinaabe burial site. The Canadian government took control of that land for military use during World War II, promised to return the land when it was no longer needed, but of course it was not. On September 4th, 1995, around 30 land protectors from the Stony Point First Nation set up a reoccupation on Ipperwash Provincial Park to reclaim the ancestral burial site. So on September 5th, the provincial government, under then Premier Mike Harris, signaled that the occupation would be treated as a law enforcement issue, not a land rights negotiation. The occupiers were wary of police negotiation efforts, fearing criminalization, and communication channels were weak or non-existent. The next day, an Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, crowd management unit and riot gear approached the park, and that night, unverified reports of gunfire and the assumption of potential violence contributed to escalation. The next day, September 7th, Ojibwe land defender Dudley George, also known as Anthony George, was shot dead by an OPP sniper, and he died in the early hours of September 7th. The police claimed the land defenders were armed, which is a statement that was later proven false, and we know now that Dudley George was holding a wooden stick at the time. After this, the situation is described as having entered sort of a status quo, but no resolution phase, and there's no clearly documented moment at which the land defenders left the area. It wasn't until about 2 years later that Kenneth Dean, the one who shot Dudley George, was convicted of criminal negligence causing death for his fatal shooting. Dean was sentenced to 180 hours of community service and 1 year probation. It wasn't until 2003 that the Ipperwash crisis was launched to investigate the events surrounding the death of Dudley George, the role of the OPP, and the actions of the Ontario government during the crisis. And then it wasn't until 2016, about 21 years later, that ownership of the land was officially transferred to the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point. The third one, if we could move on to the next slide there. In 1995, that same year, the Gustafsen Lake standoff in British Columbia was a 31-day confrontation between the Secwepemc land defenders and the RCMP on unceded ceremonial land in central BC. Throughout the early 90s, members of the nation held Sundance ceremonies on land around Gustafsen Lake, which was leased by a rancher named Lyle James. That rancher had made an agreement with the Sundance organizers to share the land for the duration of their ceremony, asked that they not build any permanent fences or buildings, which the organizers later did in '95, which led to escalating tensions. On August 18th of that year, '95, about 30 people did not leave the land after their usual amount of time that they would be there for the ceremony. Lyle James, the rancher, contacted the RCMP after they refused to leave. The RCMP attempted to negotiate, first with the Sundancers, and then with local Indigenous leadership and the Assembly of First Nations, and began surveilling the area. By late August, RCMP began preparing a large-scale operation. They set up exclusion zones, media restrictions, and tactical operations. The camp included members of the Secwepemc Nation and other Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and they began to call themselves the Tsapeten, emphasizing the land was unceded territory. On September 11th of that year, the RCMP detonated an explosive device on an access road that disabled a supply truck driven by unarmed supporters attempting to deliver food and water. The explosion triggered a firefight between the defenders and the RCMP tactical units, with reports of hundreds of rounds fired. September 12th, the RCMP shot an unarmed individual crossing, or they shot at the individual crossing what was supposed to be a no-shoot zone, which the RCMP later admitted to be an error. The standoff ended on September 17th when the remaining camp members left peacefully. So the RCMP operation was brought to a close once they left, after mobilizing about 400 tactical officers and spending millions of taxpayer dollars. In the aftermath of that struggle, 18 people were charged in connection with the standoff. 14 of them were Indigenous, 4 were non-Indigenous. They were found guilty and received prison sentences ranging from 6 months to 8 years. One of them, after being released, actually fled to the United States and was granted political asylum on the basis that his actions were of a political character in resisting occupation of unceded land. The RCMP admitted that up to 77,000 rounds of ammunition may have been fired during the standoff, and that operation is described as the largest paramilitary police action in BC's history. So to close off that summary, these 3 land defense movements were not isolated events. They were part of a much longer story of Indigenous resistance, and to understand why these communities took such strong action, we have to look at what came before, the centuries of broken promises, land seizures, and the growing push for self-determination. And so Rithika will take us through that deeper history and show how these earlier struggles, from 18th century land petitions, the movements of the 60s and 70s during the Red Power movement, led to these land back struggles. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for going through the specifics of what happened. I just want to zoom out a little bit and look at the longer historical arc between a lot of these flashpoints, because we really have to be honest about what happens when nations are pushed against their political and legal limits. Direct action is almost never a first resort. It's what communities turn to when every other avenue has been exhausted or co-opted. So blockades and occupations usually only come after there has been decades of court battles or negotiations, and a lot of ignored consultations. And like Sam mentioned, they don't come without cost. People are criminalized, and families are torn apart, and a lot of the times people die, and the pain in that struggle is real. But that kind of direct action also exposes the truth, which is that the so-called rule of law in this country depends on keeping Indigenous people in their place, and the moment that they resist it, the state calls it a crisis. So what happened in Oka, was the direct result of centuries of broken promises to the Mohawk community of Kanehsatà. In the 1600s, French priest from the seminary of St. Sulpice, persuaded Mohawk families to move from Montreal to the land at Kanehsatà. And due to settlers at this time, rapidly encroaching and into their settlements in Montreal, the Mohawks agreed because they were moving to their ancestral hunting and fishing lands, and they were also promised that they would be left alone if they agreed to this move. In addition to that, they were promised that the land would remain theirs, and the priests would only be holding it in trust. But then, in 1763, when Britain took control after the 7 Years' War, and the Crown, officially took control of the land in Canada, they recognized the priests and not the Mohawks as the title holders and owners of that land. So this started in 1600. And over the next 2 centuries, the community kept fighting to reclaim their land. They did this through petitioning the government, they demanded inquiries, and they even faced arrests for standing up to the church. But their efforts were constantly blocked. Under the Indian Act, until 1951, Indigenous people were not allowed to hire lawyers to pursue land claims or any kind of legal claim. And then by the mid-1900s, whatever little territory remained was under new pressure. The construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1956 flooded large areas of Mohawk territory, and it destroyed the local fishing economy that their families had relied on for generations. And so now we have a situation where the community's land base and their livelihoods are under existential threat. So in 1990, when, like Sam said, when the town of Oka announced plans to expand a golf course in the area, this encroached on some of the last pieces of untouched land in their traditional territory, and also included a cemetery where their ancestors and leaders were buried. And so that's when the barricades and blockades came up, because direct action at that point was the only choice left. And we're talking about 1600. I just want to stress that we're talking about 1600 to 1990. That's a long, long time. And this is really important in the context of how the Canadian state and the media framed it. A, by calling it a crisis, and B, by framing the participants as terrorists or the dangerous Indian trope. And we see this happen in Ipperwash as well. In 1942, during World War II, the federal government used the War Measures Act to seize a part of land of the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point First Nation in southwestern Ontario, because they said they needed it for a military training base, Camp Ipperwash, and they promised, again, that the land would be returned after the war. So the community didn't really have a choice. They were forced off their land, and they were relocated to the neighboring Kettle Point Reserve. And so when the war ended, guess what? The government did not give the land back. It kept using Camp Ipperwash for military purposes, and over the years, their families sent petitions, letters, delegations, even traveled to Ottawa to fight for their land back, and they were ignored. So there were generations of families who grew up hearing the promise that one day their parents' land, their cemetery, all of which will be returned to them. And by the 70s and 80s, frustration started to boil over. Indigenous people tried to have their land claims recognized through the court system, but nothing really happened. And so in the early 1990s, the military finally began to withdraw from Camp Ipperwash, but they still refused to return the land to the First Nation as title holders. And so by then, there was about half a century of waiting, and the patience in the community had run out, and so people began to reoccupy the site peacefully. And then the province declared Ipperwash Provincial Park off limits, and members of the Stony Point community moved to protect their burial grounds. And this, again, was never a sudden act of defiance. It happened after they had exhausted all their options. And these movements, also reflected a continuity of a larger Indigenous movement that had formed in the decades prior. So in the 1960s and 70s, Indigenous people across North America were entering what is often called the Red Power era. And in the Red Power years, there were a lot of high-profile occupations and confrontations all across North America. There was Alcatraz in 1969, there was Wounded Knee in 1973, and all of these movements fueled a wave of legal and political mobilization. And in Canada, that culminated in the Constitution Express, when in 1980, when hundreds of Indigenous leaders from across the country traveled to Ottawa and even to Europe to demand that Indigenous rights be recognized in the Canadian Constitution. So yeah, as we can see, these movements were really rooted in intergenerational organizing. It means that it wasn't restricted to a certain era. Families were raised listening to these stories, and they were told what their promises were, how they were broken. They were very intimately aware of the efforts that these nations had gone through to get their land back. And so when land defenders stood their ground in the 90s, they were carrying forward this decade of struggle for sovereignty rooted in the Red Power movement and the constitutional fights that came before them. And so I'm going to turn back to Sam here, because you've been part of quite a few land defense movements today. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak to what that continuity looks like and what's changed in the way Indigenous communities are organizing today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rithika. I've had the privilege of learning from people who are part of these movements, people who are present at Oka, people who stood up against pipelines and development projects all across Turtle Island. I'm based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's known as Shibuktuk in Mi'kmaq, the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. There are three main lessons that I want to take from this based on the work that we did preparing for this, but also I would say more like water protector movements that I've been part of over the last 10 to 15 years. And when I learn about these stories, it's not just to remember, but to learn how to act. So there's three main lessons that I want to take away. First, as Rithika explained, land defense is not spontaneous. as the mainstream media likes to sensationalize the spontaneity of barricades or blockades. It's rather the continuation of organized intergenerational resistance that forces the state to reckon with Indigenous sovereignty. So what may appear to many people from the mainstream media as protest or an uprising is in fact the latest chapter in centuries of organized resistance. Intergenerational struggle that goes into these is a form of nationhood because it preserves the law, the Indigenous language, and our relationship to the land. Second, true solidarity requires the courage to take risks and make sacrifices under Indigenous direction. That goes for Indigenous people on Turtle Island, but also non-Indigenous people. So at Ipperwash, non-Indigenous silence is part of what led to media narratives going unchallenged for years. From the Ipperwash inquiry coming so many years later, land being returned finally over 20 years later, it was the silence of non-Indigenous people that led to, or helped lead to that. At Gustafsen Lake, outside supporters faced criminalization, but also, internationalized the issue, showing that solidarity carries both risk and responsibility. 4 of the people, again, who were arrested during that time and received charges were not Indigenous. Going back to the Oka crisis, there are a lot of lessons to draw about anti-racist solidarity. Looking at Quebec, which is often portrayed as uniquely racist, but is also home to powerful anti-racist and anti-colonial movements. For a long time, these movements have recognized Indigenous sovereignty as central to liberation struggles, and you won't see that in the mainstream media. We could talk about allyship and anti-racism among non-Indigenous people in theory, but actually in practice, looking at Oka, there are a lot of lessons to draw. When the standoff began in July 1990, activist networks in and around Montreal mobilized almost immediately, and these were some of the largest mobilizations in the country. Groups like anti-racist coalitions, anarchist collectives, feminist organizations, and student unions formed support committees to gather food, medical supplies, and legal aid for Mohawk land defenders, both at Kanehsatà and Kanehsatà on the Mercier Ridge. Solidarity groups coordinated food, medical supplies, and transportation for families cut off by police blockades in and around those areas. Volunteer drivers took part in supply convoys, some of which were blocked or threatened by settlers along rural highways. Community kitchens and church basements in Montreal collected food and blankets for those behind the barricades. Healthcare workers like nurses and paramedics, sympathetic to the cause, provided medical support and baby supplies for those inside the community. Solidarity groups also fought back against the intense anti-Indigenous racism in the media. Independent journalists and filmmakers used their access to document police abuse and give Indigenous people space to speak for themselves. This goes especially for those connected to the National Film Board and to Elena's Abamsuin's work. Her film, Kanehsatà, 270 Years of Resistance, was largely filmed from inside the blockade, inside the community throughout the siege, filming the behind-the-scene scenes at the barricades as tanks and soldiers in the media encircled the defenders. Activists in Montreal also held press briefings, teach-ins at McGill and Concordia to challenge the framing of the crisis as a law and order issue. And in the streets of Montreal, people distributed leaflets titled Stop Racism, Support Kanehsatà, linking the police assault to broader struggles against colonialism. This was all done at a real personal risk, as the RCMP and the SQ were monitoring these efforts, and organizers faced threats from other settler mobs, like what was shown in the film, and doxing in local papers. The period also overlapped with other solidarity movements like anti-apartheid, and known as Legal in Montreal, which led to the founding of that. And feminist groups like the Quebec Women's Federation publicly denounced the sexism and racism directed at Indigenous women land defenders. The third lesson that I want to draw and leave off with is that to make our movements more effective, socialists must treat decolonization as a material land-based demand and as a class-based demand. The best, I think, local and more recent example of this is the 1492 land-back lane struggle and the solidarity shown by the labor movement and non-Indigenous ally groups. And there may be people here who can speak to that personally, so I'll leave that for the discussion. But my personal experience of that, it sort of went from 2014 to 2021 during the Stop Alton Gas campaign, which was based in Mi'kmaq, Sipekne'katik territory in central Nova Scotia. For those who aren't familiar, the Alton Gas project was a proposed fossil fuel project that would have cleared out salt formations and dispose of large volumes of brine into the Shubenacadie River and store natural gas in these caverns. So it's kind of like reverse fracking, if you think about it. If you're aware of hydraulic fracturing, taking fossil fuels out of the ground, this would have been to put them back into the ground. So in 2014, the blockade went up at the work site. We built a treaty truck house on the river, and the Grassroots Grandmothers campaign became visible. The campaign was Mi'kmaq-led, with initiative being taken by community members from the surrounding area and mixed levels of support from elected band councils. There was a discrepancy between what we would call, I guess, like grassroots Indigenous leadership and what we would also call like Indian Act band councils, which led to political disagreements within Mi'kmaq communities about, how to engage in the struggle. So some supported a more legalistic approach that favored so-called, consultations or impact benefit agreements and, the subsequent court appeals, and some supported an approach based more on direct action and mass mobilizing. And these divisions within Mi'kmaq communities posed a dilemma to non-Mi'kmaq supporters about which approaches to favor and who to align with. So it caused confusion about, who to take direction from and raised questions about meddling in the internal affairs of an oppressed group. So one of the tenets of anti-racist work is, to not meddle in, the internal disagreements of the group you're supporting, but also when you're taking direction, there's confusion about sort of who to support and how within that community. I can talk more about union support there. We had an organization called Solidarity with Alton Gas Resistance. It was a network of labor activists that used what Labor for Palestine does in a similar way, where we passed resolutions at the union local level and at labor councils and eventually the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor. It was contentious at the time, leading up to 2017, where some unions were supporting and some weren't. But when it came to a heated discussion at the 2017 convention, there was disagreement about if or how much to support the water protectors. We eventually passed a motion at the Federation of Labor Convention to donate $5,000, which was eventually matched by affiliate union locals and labor councils. And that led to other similar motions where those unions and labor councils donated larger amounts of money, mobilized their members to stand on the front line with water protectors, and to bring union flags and things like that to show visible support. So that was really powerful, where we had the RCMP on one side constantly threatening water protectors, but on the other side we had flags from the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, PSAC, NSGEU, CUPE, unions that represent tens of thousands of workers standing on the side of water protectors and standing up against the RCMP. So to leave off, this all shows how socialists can confront settler colonialism. Solidarity with Indigenous struggle is not inherently radical, but it has the potential to be. So supporting Indigenous sovereignty as a class demand, means that this arises from the collective interests of working class people, and that we can move our unions to recognize that land back and workers' power are part of the same struggle, and that they both challenge capitalist ownership of land and production. So to leave off, socialists need to support Indigenous strategy and work in tandem. Land defense combines direct action, community care, and ceremony, and this shows how radicals can root political struggle in relationships and not just ideology. Movements are more effective when they link spiritual and material and political work, and these ways of organizing and being together have implications for how we run meetings, how we campaign, and how we bargain. And all of this requires building relationships beyond crises, so not just event-based allyship as certain struggles sort of pop up and come and go, but actually building long-term, lifelong friendships and camaraderie that extend beyond political objectives. So with that, I want to pass it back to Rithika to offer some more broader political analysis, but also talk a bit about, given the long history and what we're up against, what is the hope and what is the objective in engaging legally with these struggles? Thank you.
This is just information about some current land back struggles that are ongoing, so feel free to take a picture. They're actively soliciting donations for solidarity and their movements, so we'll just leave that up there for a bit. Okay, so I think when we think back to the 90s, like I said, one thing the Canadian state and the media did a lot was try to frame these moments as crises for the state, when in reality I think they were crises of the state. And they were crises of sovereignty because they forced Canada to confront something that it's never fully resolved, which is the idea that you cannot be a constitutional liberal democracy when you sit on stolen land. And if we fast forward to today, we see this thriving industry of reconciliation. And we're living in a time of, the reconciliation industrial complex, which is a machinery that professionalizes and manages and neutralizes Indigenous resistance while ensuring that the underlying economic relations remain untouched. So sovereignty now gets rerouted into consultation meetings and federal grants, and there's a whole professional class of consultants and lawyers and engagement advisors whose job is, for the most part, send a message to Indigenous communities that their anger is valid, but only if they express it through bureaucratic processes. And Sam kind of alluded to this, but the state also manages Indigenous resistance by managing Indigenous governance itself. So under the Indian Act, Indian band councils are not traditional governments. They were created in 1876, and they're administrative bodies that are funded and regulated by the federal government. And the authority of band councils is over reserve land and over programs and services, but not the entire traditional territory of any given nation. And in contrast, our hereditary chiefs and clan systems are traditional governance systems that predate Canada, and they hold authority over entire territories, forests, rivers, hunting grounds, and their legitimacy comes from Indigenous law, not Canadian law or Canadian recognition. But we see the situation where when corporations, want to build a pipeline, for example, they go to band councils because band councils are what have legal standing under Canadian law. And sometimes band councils can and do represent the will of their constituents, but not always. And this creates a kind of conflict and disruption, and it's lateral violence. It creates lateral violence, it's state-sanctioned lateral violence. And this division sort of bubbles up through internally within Indigenous communities themselves. And so when these state-sanctioned divisions don't produce obedience, then we see the next shift, which is from negotiation to outright criminalization. And after the 90s, after all of the land back movements and others that we spoke about, the state, for the most part, feared the optics of overt violence and the overt standoff between, the Canadian state on one hand and Indigenous land defenders on the other hand. And today it does a great job of hiding that violence behind courts. Injunctions have become sort of the most powerful tool to neutralize Indigenous resistance and land defense. Since 2010, more than 80% of injunctions filed by corporations against land defenders are granted, and fewer than 20% of injunctions filed by Indigenous nations against corporations are granted. And once an injunction against Indigenous people is granted, everything changes, because now land defense is not just a political movement, it becomes criminal. And when you violate an injunction, you're no longer resisting, a pipeline company or a corporation, you're disobeying the court of law. And that legitimizes the full force of the state. If we go to the Wet'suwet'en land defense, for example, in 2020, their RCMP had the CIRG squad, which is a community industry response group. And it is a taxpayer-funded tactical response unit that has a mandate of protecting resource companies and evidently brutalizing Indigenous land defenders. And I just want to pause for a moment so we can all take that in, because your taxpayers are paying for a government-funded military unit that is protecting corporations. I mean, that alone should be enough for a general strike. And so you can see how that shift from relegating land defense to courtrooms is not really accidental. It reflects this deepening alignment, and an alignment that's increasing at an alarming rate between state and capital. I'm sure the various Bill 5, Bill C5 might come up in discussion, but pipeline companies and mining and real estate, these are all core accumulation strategies. They always have been in the history of Canada, and it's just another extension of the RCMP's original task, which was to remove and separate Indigenous people from their land and enforce colonial rule. There really is no difference between, the historic RCMP and the Northwest Mounted Police and its functions today. So to answer your question, Sam, about the avenues of hope in law, I think the law is a terrain of struggle, and not an optional terrain of struggle. We have to engage with it, but it's never a source of liberation. There is no hope in the moral authority of Canadian courts, because it is those same courts and the same law that were built to secure private property through dispossession, and they continue to maintain that dispossession today. But there is a lot of hope in sort of what movements have been doing to use law strategically. As it's come up a lot during this conference, revolutionary socialists have to reject ultra-leftism and activism that, refuses to engage with institutions completely, institutions like courts or unions, because, they are seen as corrupt. But the reality is that movements, and our movements, are about changing the material conditions of people. And in a settler colonial state like Canada, as we've seen, the land question is structured, unfortunately, through law. So if we completely ignore that terrain, then we're only leaving that power uncontested in the state, in the hands of state and corporations, and we just cannot do that. We don't have that option. And when Indigenous nations win land claims or injunctions or title cases, title case that one time in 2014, it's not because the law suddenly discovered justice and all future decisions are going to follow that vision of justice. It's because movements on the ground made it impossible to rule otherwise. A lot of the evidence in Indigenous law and Aboriginal rights litigation involves providing a lot of proof that directly contradicts the legal fictions that are upheld by the Canadian state. And like we talked about, direct action is often a last resort, and people don't really want to do it. It comes with a lot of loss of life. It's a lot of effort, and we just can't refuse to engage with the courts. And so legal victories in some ways can protect communities to help them keep going and keep on doing the work on the ground that they need to do. And the gains that we get from doing legal work and engaging with the court is never the end goal. But they are footholds that can make future decolonization efforts and material transformation possible. And so going back to pulling lessons from all of this and from the 90s, in this moment of the reconciliation industrial complex, I think there's a couple things that we can hold on to. First, these movements have taught us that the state can never and will never respond to moral appeals. It only responds to pressure from the ground. The only reason Canada launched inquiries or made concessions after the 90s land back movements was because Indigenous communities forced them to, through blockades, through occupations, and full economic disruption. Reconciliation today as an industry sort of exists to precisely prevent that kind of organizing and that kind of pressure, which means that we can't just stick to policy roundtables and passing legislation to really force change. We have to remember that disruption is what actually shifts terrain. And most importantly, I think we have to protect this narrative from symbolic capture. And by that, I mean, the reconciliation industrial complex tries to turn struggle into branding. It's something that you can put on a tote bag. It's apparently something that happens when a bank funds an orange shirt campaign, but also funds a pipeline company through unceded territory. And that's really, really lethal, because once struggle becomes symbolism and nothing more, it stops being threatening. And so there's something, I think, also to learn from Palestine here. And I hope we can talk about some of the connections between Palestine and land back, because what we haven't seen, at least not yet in the Palestine movement, is this level of co-option. And obviously, the main reason that's happening is because of anti-Palestinian racism and dehumanization. But with the Indigenous struggle in Canada, the state has really found a way to turn reconciliation into sort of this investment strategy. And governments use what Glenn Coulthard calls recognition politics, which is the idea that liberal democracies think they can address historic harms and histories of colonialism through a process of acknowledgement. Like, we acknowledge that this land is unceded territory. We acknowledge that this is stolen land. But that doesn't actually create material change. And I think that lack of co-option with the Palestine movement really shatters that model. A lot of Palestinian liberation actions sort of directly threaten the global imperial order and the imperial economy. It targets arms manufacturing, it targets energy projects, it targets the surveillance industry. And these are all the very logistical networks that capitalism really relies on to function. And more importantly, Palestine is a transnational struggle. It's kept alive, not just by Palestinians, but actually by majority of people who are not Palestinian themselves. And most of these people don't have anything direct to, gain from the struggle. It's a lot of unions, it's a lot of students, it's migrant workers, it's communities, it's people from all sorts of places and communities, and I think that makes it really hard for capital to buy off. And the demand in the Palestinian movement is non-negotiable. It's free the people, free the land. It's nothing more complex, it's nothing less complex. It's clear as day. And so the more we refuse to, let our movements be subject to this symbolic capture, and the more we refuse to collapse the idea of sovereignty into identity, the more ungovernable these movements become to the state. And that's the goal. That's what we need. So, yeah, I guess in conclusion, connecting that thread from Palestine back to Indigenous solidarity and land back in Canada, it's really important that we all participate in Indigenous solidarity movements and that we all center Indigenous self-determination in whatever movement work that we do. It has to be really central. It's not connected in this abstract way. It's connected in a very, very material reality. And the strategies that Indigenous nations have developed, defending land, practicing collective governance, and resisting extraction, like, they're lessons for everyone. And hopefully, we can talk about some of that in the discussion. Thank you.